They never saw it coming when Brad Williams and his crew cornered the quiet new girl in art class, demanding she use the paper cutter on her own fingers as some twisted initiation ritual. Maya Chen had been at Riverside High for barely 3 weeks, keeping to herself, never causing trouble, never fighting back against their escalating harassment. What Brad and his followers Dylan and Kevin didn't know was that Maya had been training in traditional Okinawan karate since she was 5 years old under her grandfather's strict guidance, earning her black belt just 6 months before moving to Cedar Falls. What happened next didn't just shock everyone in room 118. It completely transformed how an entire school understood the difference between real strength and meaningless cruelty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the evergreen-covered hills surrounding Cedar Falls, Washington, as another typical March day began. At Riverside High School, the Pacific Northwest spring brought with it the familiar rhythm of rain pattering against classroom windows and the sweet fragrance of cherry blossoms beginning to bloom in the school's central courtyard. Students hurried through the modern, glass corridors clutching steaming coffee cups from the local café, their conversations echoing off the polished floors as they navigated between lockers adorned with college pennants and club announcements. Riverside High had been built only 15 years earlier, designed with an emphasis on natural light and open spaces that reflected the community's connection to the surrounding forest landscape. Large windows in every classroom offered views of towering Douglas firs and the occasional glimpse of Mount Rainier on clear days. The school took pride in its comprehensive arts program, which had earned recognition throughout the state and attracted families who valued creative expression alongside academic excellence. The student body of nearly 800 reflected the changing demographics of Cedar Falls, a town that had evolved from a small logging community into a suburban refuge for families seeking affordable housing within commuting distance of Seattle. The hallways buzzed with conversations in multiple languages, representing the diversity of families who had discovered this hidden gem nestled between mountain and sea. Academic achievement was highly valued, but so was the kind of outdoor recreation that defined Pacific Northwest culture. Hiking, skiing, and environmental stewardship were woven into the school's identity. Maya Sheen stood at her locker on the second floor, carefully organizing her art supplies for third period. At 15, she possessed a quiet grace that seemed almost out of place among the typical high school chaos surrounding her. Her straight, black hair fell just past her shoulders, often pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed intelligent dark eyes that missed very little. Maya's movements were precise and economical, whether she was arranging her textbooks or walking through the crowded hallways. There was something different about her posture, a centered quality that suggested both alertness and calm, though. Most of her classmates interpreted this as shyness or social awkwardness. 3 weeks had passed since Maya and her mother Susan had moved to Cedar Falls from Sacramento, following Susan's job transfer to the trauma unit at Cedar Falls Regional Medical Center. The transition had been challenging for both of them. Susan worked long shifts at the hospital, often arriving home exhausted from dealing with the kind of medical emergencies that small towns weren't always equipped to handle. Maya understood her mother's dedication to her patients, but the adjustment to a new school in the middle of the academic year had left her feeling isolated and uncertain about where she belonged in the established social ecosystem. The move had been particularly difficult because it meant leaving behind her grandfather, Chen, who had been Maya's primary influence and teacher since childhood. Grandpa Li, now 78, was a first-generation Chinese-American who had served 2 tours in Vietnam before dedicating his life to teaching traditional martial arts. His small dojo in Sacramento's Chinatown had been Maya's second home for the past decade, a place where she had learned not just the physical techniques of Okinawan karate but the philosophical foundations that made martial arts a way of life rather than simply a fighting system. The decision to move had been agonizing for Maya's family. Susan's expertise in trauma medicine was desperately needed in Cedar Falls, where the aging population and increase in outdoor recreation accidents had created a shortage of qualified medical professionals. The financial opportunity was significant, offering Susan the chance to pay off medical school loans while building a secure future for her daughter. But leaving Grandpa Lee behind felt like abandoning the most important relationship in Maya's life. Chen had emigrated from Hong Kong as a young man, carrying with him the traditional knowledge passed down through generations of martial artists in his family. His approach to teaching karate emphasized discipline, respect, and the responsibility that came with possessing the ability to cause harm. Maya had earned her black belt 6 months earlier, an achievement that required not just physical skill but demonstration of character and wisdom that many adults never developed. Grandpa Lee had been immensely proud of his granddaughter's accomplishment, but he had also intensified his teachings about when and how to use her abilities. The morning of what would become known throughout Riverside High as the art room incident began with Maya's usual routine of arriving early to avoid the crowds and complexity of peak social hours. She preferred the quiet moments before the hallways filled with the energy and drama of teenage life. Maya had discovered that room 118, where Mrs. Anderson taught various art classes, was often open early for students who wanted extra time to work on their projects. The art classroom had become Maya's refuge, a place where she could focus on creative expression without the pressure of navigating unfamiliar social dynamics. Mrs. Anderson was a veteran teacher in her 40s who had built Riverside High's art program from a single classroom into a comprehensive department that included ceramics, photography, digital media, and traditional drawing and painting. She had immediately recognized something special in Maya's artistic abilities, noting the patience and attention to detail that the girl brought to every assignment. Mrs. Anderson had tried several times to encourage Maya to participate in group projects or social activities related to the arts program, but Maya consistently declined, preferring to work independently. What Mrs. Anderson didn't fully understand was that Maya's reluctance to engage socially stemmed not from lack of confidence, but from her grandfather's teachings about observation and assessment. Chen had taught Maya to spend time in new environments watching and learning before making decisions about how to interact. This wisdom had served Maya well in previous situations, but at Riverside High it had unfortunately marked her as an easy target for students who interpreted quiet observation as weakness or fear. Brad Williams had noticed Maya from her first day at Riverside High, though not for reasons that would have pleased her. At 16, Brad was an imposing figure who used his physical presence and family connections to maintain his position as the school's most feared bully. Standing 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders that came from working construction jobs with his father during summers, Brad had discovered early that intimidation was an effective tool for getting what he wanted. His sandy brown hair was always perfectly styled, and his wardrobe consisted of expensive brands that announced his family's financial success to anyone who cared to notice. The Williams family had owned the largest construction company in Cedar Falls for 3 generations, building most of the new housing developments that had transformed the town from rural community to suburban destination. Brad's father, Robert Williams, had built his business through a combination of hard work and aggressive competitive tactics that sometimes crossed ethical boundaries. Robert believed that success required dominating competitors and showing no mercy to those who got in his way, lessons he had passed on to his son, both explicitly and through example. Brad's approach to social relationships mirrored his father's business philosophy. He surrounded himself with followers who benefited from his protection while contributing to his sense of power and control. Dylan Parks and Kevin Torres had attached themselves to Brad's orbit during their freshman year, discovering that aligning with his cruelty was preferable to risking becoming his targets. Dylan was tall and lean with nervous energy that made him constantly seek Brad's approval through increasingly reckless behavior. Kevin was shorter but stocky, with a round face that might have appeared friendly if not for the calculated meanness he displayed whenever Brad was watching. Together, the three boys had created a reign of terror that had lasted throughout their high school careers. They were careful to avoid the kind of obvious violence that would bring serious administrative consequences, instead specializing in psychological intimidation, social humiliation, and the kind of subtle physical aggression that was difficult for authorities to prove or punish. Their victims included anyone who seemed vulnerable, different, or unwilling to fight back, and they had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and isolating potential targets. Maya's arrival at Riverside High had immediately caught Brad's attention for all the wrong reasons. Her quiet demeanor, her reluctance to engage in social situations, and her obvious status as an outsider made her appear to be an ideal victim for the kind of systematic harassment that Brad and his crew had perfected over the years. They had begun with small incidents testing her responses to verbal taunts, shoulder bumps in the hallway, and the theft of personal items from her locker. Maya's consistent failure to retaliate or report these incidents had convinced Brad that she was exactly the kind of weak target he preferred. What Brad failed to recognize was that Maya's responses were not motivated by fear or helplessness, but by the disciplined restraint that her grandfather had spent 10 years instilling in her. Every incident of harassment was noted and analyzed. But Maya understood that her training had given her capabilities that could seriously injure her tormentors if used inappropriately. Grandpa Lee's teachings echoed in her mind during each confrontation, reminding her that true martial artists use their skills only when absolutely necessary to protect themselves or others from genuine harm. The escalation had been gradual, but deliberate. Brad's initial tests had given way to more aggressive behavior as he interpreted Maya's restraint as confirmation of her vulnerability. He began targeting her more publicly, making loud comments about her appearance and family background, organizing deliberate exclusion from group activities, and encouraging other students to participate in the harassment through social pressure and implied threats. Maya endured each incident with the same calm composure, following her grandfather's teachings about not allowing others' negative energy to disturb her inner peace. Jessica Miller had been one of the few students to notice the systematic nature of Brad's campaign against Maya. As a quiet sophomore who had herself been a victim of bullying in middle school, Jessica recognized the patterns of behavior that adults often missed or misinterpreted. She had tried several times to approach Maya with offers of friendship or support, but Maya's polite distance had made meaningful connection difficult. Jessica understood that reaching out was complicated by the social risk of associating with someone who had been marked as a target by the school's most powerful bully. The art classroom had become the primary setting for Brad's escalating harassment because Mrs. Anderson's teaching style emphasized independent work and creative exploration, creating opportunities for unsupervised interaction among students. Brad had discovered that he could torment Maya during these periods while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. He would position himself near her workspace, making comments about her projects, deliberately bumping into her easel, or accidentally spilling materials on her artwork. Mrs. Anderson had noticed the tension, but had not yet grasped the severity of the situation. Her experience with teenage social dynamics had taught her that minor conflicts often resolve themselves if given time and space. She had spoken privately with Maya about whether she was experiencing any problems, but Maya's reluctance to discuss the situation had prevented Mrs.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Anderson from understanding the true scope of Brad's campaign. The teacher's well-intentioned efforts to encourage group collaboration had inadvertently created more opportunities for harassment. The morning that would change everything began with Maya arriving at room 118 15 minutes before the official start of third period. She had been working on a watercolor landscape inspired by the view from her bedroom window, attempting to capture the way morning mist transformed the familiar outlines of Douglas firs into something ethereal and mysterious. The painting had become more than just an art assignment for Maya. It represented her effort to find beauty and meaning in her new environment, to create something positive from the challenge of starting over in an unfamiliar place. As Maya arranged her brushes and prepared her palette, she was aware of the footsteps in the hallway that indicated other students beginning to arrive for class. The familiar sound of Brad's voice carried through the open doorway, followed by the responses of Dylan and Kevin that suggested they were planning something beyond their usual harassment. Maya's training had heightened her awareness of her surroundings, allowing her to detect subtle changes in energy and intention that most people would miss. Something about the tone of the approaching conversation suggested that today would be different, that Brad's campaign was about to escalate beyond the psychological intimidation he had previously employed. Mrs. Anderson was in the supply room, organizing materials for the day's lesson, unaware of the gathering storm in her classroom. The early morning routine that had provided Maya with peaceful solitude was about to be shattered by a confrontation that would test everything her grandfather had taught her about strength, restraint, and the responsibility that came with possessing the ability to defend herself. The quiet new girl who had endured weeks of harassment was about to discover whether 10 years of martial arts training had prepared her for the moment when retreat was no longer an option and measured response became the only path to safety. Brad Williams entered room 118 with the confident swagger that had intimidated countless students over his 3 years at Riverside High School. His leather jacket hung perfectly across his broad shoulders, and his expensive sneakers made deliberate sounds against the polished floor as he surveyed the art classroom like a predator marking territory. Dylan Parks and Kevin Torres flanked him on either side, their body language broadcasting the aggressive energy that always preceded their worst behavior. The trio had spent the previous evening planning what they called Maya's final test, an escalation designed to either force her complete submission or drive her out of Riverside High altogether. The conspiracy had been born during their usual hangout session at the abandoned mill on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, where they gathered to smoke and plan their next acts of dominance. Brad had grown increasingly frustrated with Maya's failure to break under their sustained campaign of harassment. Unlike their previous victims who had either fought back ineffectively or collapsed into tears and transfer requests, Maya continued to maintain her composed silence in ways that made Brad feel diminished rather than powerful. Her quiet dignity challenged his fundamental belief that strength came from making others feel weak, and he had convinced himself that more extreme measures were necessary to restore his position. Dylan had suggested they find a way to make Maya physically prove her loyalty to their group, proposing various humiliation rituals that would demonstrate her complete powerlessness. Kevin had contributed the twisted idea of using the art room's paper cutter, reasoning that the threat of actual physical harm would finally break through Maya's mysterious composure. Brad had seized on this suggestion, recognizing an opportunity to create the kind of terror that would cement his reputation while providing him with a justification for his actions. If Maya was stupid enough to resist, he told himself she deserved whatever happened next. The plan they had developed was calculated and cruel. They would corner Maya during the independent work portion of art class, when Mrs. Anderson was typically focused on individual consultations and less likely to notice their activities. Dylan would block the main exit while Kevin positioned himself near the supply closet, creating a triangle of intimidation that would make escape impossible. Brad would then present Maya with what he called a choice, demanding that she use the industrial paper cutter to remove the tip of her own finger as proof of her respect for their authority. The psychological impact of the threat, combined with the public nature of the humiliation, would either destroy her completely or force her to submit to their control. What none of them understood was that their planning session had been observed by David Kim, a quiet junior who spent his free time photographing wildlife in the forest surrounding Cedar Falls. David had been documenting the abandoned mill's gradual reclamation by nature when he overheard their conversation through the broken windows. The photography equipment that made him nearly invisible in natural settings had allowed him to record portions of their planning session, though he struggled with how to respond to what he had learned. David's own experiences as a target of Brad's harassment had taught him the dangers of direct confrontation, but the severity of what he had overheard demanded some kind of action. Maya's awareness of the approaching threat came not from any specific intelligence, but from the heightened sensitivity that years of martial arts training had developed in her. As she worked on her watercolor painting, she noticed the subtle changes in classroom energy that indicated danger was approaching. The conversations among other students had taken on a different quality, with nervous glances and whispered exchanges suggesting that something significant was about to happen. Maya's peripheral vision caught the way Brad, Dylan, and Kevin were positioning themselves around the room, their movements too deliberate and coordinated to be casual. The teachings of her grandfather echoed in Maya's mind as she continued painting, her brush strokes remaining steady despite her growing awareness of the developing situation. Chen had spent countless hours training Maya to recognize the difference between general alertness and specific threat assessment. The approaching confrontation felt different from the previous weeks of harassment, carrying with it an intensity that suggested physical danger rather than mere psychological intimidation. Maya began the mental preparation rituals that her grandfather had taught her, centering her breathing and reviewing the principles that would guide her response to whatever was coming. Mrs. Anderson remained focused on helping Jessica Miller with a challenging perspective drawing, unaware of the brewing confrontation in her classroom. The art teacher's dedication to individual instruction, while beneficial for student learning, created the unsupervised environment that Brad and his crew had been waiting for. Jessica, however, had noticed the unusual tension and found herself glancing repeatedly toward Maya's workspace with growing concern. The shy sophomore had developed protective instincts toward the new girl, recognizing in Maya's quiet strength something admirable that deserved support rather than persecution. Emma Rodriguez, the student council member who sat near the windows, had also picked up on the threatening atmosphere developing in the room. As someone who took pride in Riverside High's inclusive environment, Emma had been troubled by the persistent harassment she had witnessed over the past 3 weeks. Her position in student government had given her insight into the administration's efforts to address bullying, but she also understood the limitations of official intervention in situations where victims were reluctant to come forward. Emma found herself torn between her desire to help Maya and her uncertainty about how to intervene effectively. The industrial paper cutter that would become central to the confrontation sat on the counter near the supply closet, its heavy metal construction and sharp blade making it one of the more dangerous tools in the art classroom. Mrs. Anderson required special permission for students to use the device, which was capable of cutting through multiple layers of heavy paper with minimal effort. The machine's presence in the room had always been carefully supervised, but Brad's plan deliberately exploited the brief moments when Mrs. Anderson's attention was focused elsewhere. Ryan Foster, a senior who had been one of Brad's earliest victims during freshman year, watched the developing situation with a mixture of dread and recognition. Ryan's own experience of systematic harassment had left him with lasting anxiety about confrontation, but he also possessed hard-won knowledge about Brad's methods and escalation patterns. The intensity he observed in Brad's behavior reminded Ryan of the worst period of his own victimization, when the harassment had moved beyond psychological intimidation toward threats of physical harm. Ryan found himself facing a moral crisis, knowing that intervention could make him a target again. while understanding that silence made him complicit in whatever was about to happen. Chloe Watson, whose popularity and social connections had always protected her from Brad's attention, found herself paying closer attention to Maya than she had previously. Chloe's privileged position in the school's social hierarchy had insulated her from the kind of systematic harassment that other students experienced, but she was beginning to recognize the moral implications of her passive observation. The new girl's quiet dignity and artistic talent had earned Chloe's grudging respect, and she was starting to question her own role in maintaining the social dynamics that enabled Brad's behavior. Maya's watercolor painting depicted the view from her bedroom window during the precious moments just after sunrise, when the morning mist transformed the familiar landscape into something mysterious and beautiful. The painting had become her way of finding peace in her new environment, capturing the natural beauty that reminded her of the philosophical teachings her grandfather had shared during their training sessions. The delicate layers of color required patience and precision, qualities that Maya had developed through years of practicing martial arts forms and meditation techniques. As the minutes passed and the official start of class approached, Maya became increasingly aware that the confrontation she had sensed was imminent. Brad's movements around the classroom had become more focused, and the nervous energy from other students suggested that many of them recognized the approaching crisis. Maya continued working on her painting while mentally reviewing the defensive techniques that might be necessary if the situation escalated beyond verbal intimidation. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that the strongest warriors were those who fought only when all other options had been exhausted. The sound of the second bell indicated that class had officially begun, but Mrs. Anderson was still helping Jessica with her perspective project near the front of the room. Brad exchanged meaningful glances with Dylan and Kevin, confirming that their moment had arrived. The three boys began moving into their predetermined positions with the kind of casual efficiency that came from extensive practice and orchestrated intimidation. Other students in the classroom sensed the shift in energy, with some instinctively moving away from Maya's workspace, while others found themselves frozen by the familiar dread that accompanied Brad's worst behaviors. David Kim, still struggling with his knowledge of their plan, made a desperate decision to try creating a distraction by accidentally knocking over a container of brushes near Mrs. Anderson's desk. The commotion drew the teacher's attention for several moments, but it also provided Brad with the perfect cover for his approach to Maya's workspace. David's well-intentioned intervention had inadvertently created the very opportunity that Brad needed to begin his planned assault. Maya felt the familiar calm that her grandfather had taught her to access during moments of crisis, a centered state of mind that allowed for clear thinking and appropriate response regardless of external pressure. The approaching footsteps and whispered commands between Brad and his followers confirmed that the situation was about to escalate beyond anything she had previously experienced at Riverside High. Maya's brush continued moving across the watercolor paper with steady precision, but her awareness expanded to include every detail of her surroundings and every possible option for response. The teachings that had sustained Maya through 10 years of martial arts training included not just physical techniques but philosophical principles about the appropriate use of force and the responsibility that came with possessing dangerous skills. Her grandfather had repeatedly emphasized that the greatest victories were achieved through wisdom and restraint rather than violence, but he had also made clear that defending oneself and others from genuine harm was both a right and a duty. Maya found herself approaching the moment when she would need to determine whether Brad's escalating harassment had crossed the line into actual danger. Jessica Miller, who had finished her consultation with Mrs. Anderson, noticed the predatory way that Brad, Dylan, and Kevin were converging on Maya's workspace. Jessica's own experience with bullying had taught her to recognize the signs of impending violence, and everything about the current situation suggested that the new girl was about to face something far worse than the harassment she had endured over the past 3 weeks. Jessica felt torn between her desire to help and her fear of becoming a target herself, a moral dilemma that reflected the complex social dynamics that allowed bullying to flourish even in environments where adults were present and presumably in control. The moment of truth was approaching as Brad positioned himself directly behind Maya's chair while Dylan and Kevin took up their blocking positions near the exits. The art classroom, which had been Maya's refuge and source of creative expression, was about to become the setting for a confrontation that would test everything she had learned about strength, restraint, and the courage required to stand up for what was right. The quiet new girl who had endured weeks of systematic harassment was about to discover whether her grandfather's teachings had prepared her for the moment when retreat was no longer possible and decisive action became the only path to safety and dignity. Brad Williams approached Maya's workspace with the predatory confidence of someone who had never encountered genuine resistance to his will. His heavy footsteps echoed deliberately against the classroom floor as he positioned himself directly behind her chair, close enough that his shadow fell across her watercolor painting. Maya could feel the heat radiating from his presence and smell the sharp scent of his cologne mixed with the lingering odor of cigarettes that clung to his leather jacket. The intimidation tactic was calculated and familiar, designed to make his target feel trapped and powerless before any words were even spoken. Maya's brush continued its delicate movement across the paper, adding subtle gradations of blue and gray to represent the morning mist that transformed the Douglas firs outside her bedroom window. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, following the rhythmic patterns that her grandfather Chen had taught her during countless meditation sessions in his Sacramento dojo. Each exhale released tension while each inhale brought renewed focus and clarity. The painting before her served as an anchor point, a visual reminder of the beauty and peace that existed beyond the immediate threat gathering around her. Memories of her grandfather's teachings flooded through Maya's consciousness like a protective wave. She could hear his patient voice explaining the ancient wisdom that had been passed down through generations of martial artists in their family. Chen had emigrated from Hong Kong, carrying not just the physical techniques of traditional Okinawan karate, but the philosophical foundations that made martial arts a complete system for living with integrity and purpose. His small dojo in Sacramento's Chinatown had been more than just a training facility. It had been a sanctuary where young people learned to transform fear into courage and anger into disciplined strength. During their training sessions, Grandpa Lee had often shared stories from his youth in Hong Kong, where he had learned from masters who understood that true martial arts were about far more than fighting techniques. These elderly teachers had survived wars, political upheaval, and personal tragedies by maintaining their commitment to principles that transcended individual circumstances. They had taught Lee that the greatest victories were achieved not through violence, but through the wisdom to know when force was necessary and the restraint to use only the minimum required to restore safety and dignity. Maya remembered the countless hours she had spent practicing forms in her grandfather's dojo, repeating the same movements until they became as natural as breathing. Each technique had been accompanied by lessons about its appropriate application and the responsibility that came with possessing the ability to cause harm. Chen had been particularly emphatic about the importance of using martial arts skills only when absolutely necessary to protect oneself or others from genuine danger. The strongest person in any situation, he had taught Maya repeatedly, was often the one who chose not to fight. The philosophical training had been as rigorous as the physical instruction. Maya had studied the writings of ancient masters who emphasized that martial arts were ultimately about creating harmony rather than conflict. She had learned about the concept of de-escalation, the art of resolving dangerous situations through calm presence and clear communication rather than violence. Her grandfather had made her practice scenarios where she had to determine whether a threat was real or merely psychological, teaching her to distinguish between situations that required physical response and those that could be resolved through other means. Dylan Parks had taken his position near the main exit, his nervous energy manifesting in the constant fidgeting that characterized his personality. At 17, Dylan had discovered that aligning himself with Brad's cruelty provided protection from becoming a target himself, but it also required him to participate in behaviors that often made him deeply uncomfortable. His role in the planned confrontation was to prevent Maya from leaving the classroom, using his height and position to create a psychological barrier that would reinforce her sense of being trapped and helpless. Kevin Torres moved toward the supply closet with calculated casualness, his stocky frame positioned to block access to the area where students typically sought refuge during confrontations. Kevin had learned to mask his own insecurities behind a facade of aggressive loyalty to Brad, convincing himself that their victims somehow deserved the treatment they received. His assignment was to control the secondary exit route while also having access to the paper cutter that would become central to their plan for Maya's final humiliation. Mrs. Anderson remained focused on organizing supplies for the day's advanced drawing lesson, her attention absorbed by the complex logistics of managing art materials for nearly 30 students with varying skill levels and project requirements. The dedicated teacher had built Riverside High's art program through years of patient advocacy and creative instruction, but her commitment to providing individual attention often meant that she missed the subtle social dynamics playing out in her classroom. The timing of Brad's approach had been carefully calculated to exploit these brief moments when supervision was less direct. Jessica Miller had returned to her own workspace, but found herself unable to concentrate on her perspective drawing project. The shy sophomore kept glancing toward Maya's corner of the room, her own experiences with bullying having taught her to recognize the signs of impending violence. Jessica's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her pencil, torn between her desire to help Maya and her fear of attracting Brad's attention to herself. The moral complexity of the situation reflected the broader challenges that students faced when witnessing harassment, knowing that intervention could provide protection for one person while creating danger for another. Emma Rodriguez had abandoned any pretense of working on her own art project, instead watching the developing situation with growing alarm. As a student council member, Emma had participated in numerous discussions about creating a more inclusive and safe school environment, but those conversations had focused primarily on policy changes and administrative responses rather than the immediate moral choices that individual students faced during actual incidents. She found herself questioning whether her previous inaction during Maya's weeks of harassment made her partially responsible for the escalation that was now occurring. The industrial paper cutter sat ominously on the counter near Kevin's position, its heavy metal construction and sharp blade representing a level of potential danger that elevated the situation far beyond typical schoolyard harassment. The machine was designed to cut through multiple layers of heavy paper with minimal effort, requiring careful handling and respect for its capacity to cause serious injury. Mrs. Anderson had established strict protocols for its use, but those safeguards assumed that students would approach the equipment with appropriate caution and legitimate educational purposes. Ryan Foster, whose senior status had provided him with some protection from Brad's attention in recent years, watched the unfolding situation with a mixture of recognition and dread. His own traumatic experiences during freshman year had left him with lasting anxiety about confrontation, but they had also given him insight into Brad's methods and escalation patterns. The systematic way that Brad, Dylan, and Kevin were positioning themselves reminded Ryan of the worst incidents from his own victimization, when psychological intimidation had given way to threats of actual physical harm. Chloe Watson found herself facing an uncomfortable reckoning with her own privilege and previous indifference to the harassment that occurred around her. Her popularity and social connections had always insulated her from becoming a target, but they had also created a sense of moral distance from the experiences of students like Maya who lacked similar protection. The quiet dignity that Maya had maintained, despite weeks of systematic abuse, had begun to challenge Chloe's assumptions about strength and vulnerability, forcing her to question her own role in maintaining the social dynamics that enabled Brad's behavior. Maya's watercolor painting continued to evolve under her steady brushstrokes, the layers of translucent color building into a representation of the peaceful morning landscape that had become her refuge in Cedar Falls. The painting process itself had become a form of meditation, connecting her to the natural beauty that surrounded her new home while providing an outlet for the creative expression that her grandfather had always encouraged. Art and martial arts shared common foundations in discipline, patience, and the pursuit of harmony between intention and execution. The approaching confrontation carried with it an intensity that Maya recognized from her training in situational awareness. Her grandfather had taught her to distinguish between different types of threats, from the empty posturing that characterized most bullying behavior to the genuine danger signals that indicated real intent to cause harm. The coordinated positioning of Brad and his followers, combined with their proximity to potentially dangerous equipment, suggested that this incident would be qualitatively different from the harassment she had endured over the past 3 weeks. Chen's voice echoed in Maya's memory as she recalled one of their most important training sessions, conducted just before her black belt examination 6 months earlier. Her grandfather had explained that earning the black belt was not an endpoint but a beginning, marking the moment when a martial artist became fully responsible for the ethical use of their abilities. The physical techniques were merely tools, he had emphasized. The real test of a martial artist's development came in their ability to make wise decisions under pressure about when and how to apply their training. David Kim, still struggling with the weight of his knowledge about Brad's plan, had positioned himself near the classroom's emergency phone, hoping to find an opportunity to alert someone in authority about the developing crisis. His background in photography had taught him to observe situations carefully and anticipate decisive moments, skills that were now creating an almost unbearable tension as he watched events unfold according to the script he had overheard at the abandoned mill. David's own experiences as a target of Brad's harassment had taught him the costs of direct confrontation, but the severity of what he knew was planned demanded some form of intervention. The other students in the classroom had begun to sense the shift in energy that preceded Brad's worst behaviors, their conversations becoming more subdued and their movements more cautious. Years of shared experience had taught them to recognize the warning signs that indicated someone was about to become the target of systematic humiliation or worse. The collective awareness created a palpable tension that seemed to thicken the air in room 118, transforming the usually creative and supportive environment into something that felt dangerous and unpredictable. Maya found herself entering the mental state that her grandfather had called the eye of the storm, a place of absolute calm and clarity that existed at the center of chaos and threat. This psychological sanctuary had been developed through years of meditation practice and stress inoculation training, allowing her to maintain optimal decision-making capability even when faced with extreme pressure or danger. From this centered place, Maya could assess the developing situation with the kind of objectivity that would be essential for choosing the most appropriate response. The sound of Brad clearing his throat behind her chair signaled that the verbal phase of the confrontation was about to begin. Maya could feel the attention of the entire classroom focusing on their corner of the room, the anticipation building, like pressure in a sealed container. Her grandfather's teachings about the appropriate response to aggression flowed through her consciousness like a calming river, reminding her that true strength was demonstrated not through the eagerness to fight, but through the wisdom to choose the response that would create the best outcome for everyone involved. The industrial paper cutter represented more than just a potential weapon in Brad's plan. It symbolized the escalation from psychological harassment to the threat of actual physical harm that marked a critical threshold in any confrontation. Maya's training had included extensive instruction about recognizing when situations move beyond the realm of social conflict into actual danger requiring defensive action. The presence of the cutting device, combined with the coordinated positioning of her antagonists, suggested that she was approaching that threshold regardless of her preference for peaceful resolution. Mrs. Anderson's voice could be heard in the background providing instruction to another student about color theory and composition, her words creating a surreal counterpoint to the tension building in Maya's corner of the classroom. The teacher's dedication to her craft and her students was evident in every interaction, but her focus on individual instruction was inadvertently creating the window of opportunity that Brad had been waiting for. The irony of art class becoming the setting for such ugliness was not lost on Maya, who had found genuine peace and expression through her creative work. The moment was approaching when words would be spoken and choices would be made that could not be undone. Maya's brush completed another delicate stroke across her watercolor paper, adding depth to the representation of morning mist that had become her symbolic refuge from the harsh realities of teenage social dynamics. The painting before her represented everything she hoped to preserve in her new life in Cedar Falls: beauty, peace, and the possibility of finding harmony even in unfamiliar surroundings. That vision was about to be tested by the kind of cruelty that her grandfather had prepared, her to face with both courage and wisdom. Brad's voice cut through the relative quiet of the art classroom like a blade, low and menacing with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to having his words create immediate fear. Well, Maya Chen," he said, deliberately emphasizing each syllable of her name as if it were something distasteful in his mouth. "Still playing the quiet little artist, I see. Still pretending like you're too good to acknowledge the people who actually matter at this school." His words carried the weight of weeks of accumulated resentment, the frustration of someone whose usual methods of intimidation had failed to produce the desired results. Maya's brush paused for the briefest moment against the watercolor paper, before continuing its gentle movement, adding another layer of soft gray to the misty landscape that had become her meditation focus. The pause was so subtle that only someone trained in observing minute details of human behavior would have noticed it, but it represented Maya's momentary acknowledgement of the threat while maintaining her commitment to finishing the artistic technique she had begun. Her grandfather Chen had taught her that maintaining focus on constructive activity during confrontation was both a form of psychological protection and a way of demonstrating that fear would not control her actions. The memories of her training sessions with Grandpa Lee flooded through Maya's consciousness with crystalline clarity. She could see him standing in the center of his Sacramento dojo, his weathered hands demonstrating the precise movements of kata forms that had been perfected over centuries of practice. His voice had been patient but firm as he explained that martial arts training was ultimately about developing the kind of inner strength that could not be shaken by external circumstances. The physical techniques were important, he had emphasized, but they were meaningless without the mental discipline to remain calm and centered regardless of what others might say or do. Chen had emigrated from Hong Kong as a young man carrying with him the traditional knowledge that had been passed down through generations of his family. His own teachers had been elderly masters who had survived the tumultuous periods of Chinese history through their commitment to principles that transcended political upheaval and social chaos. They had taught him that true martial artists were not warriors who sought conflict, but peaceful individuals who possessed the skills necessary to protect themselves and others when circumstances left no alternative. This philosophical foundation had shaped every aspect of Maya's training from her earliest childhood. Dillon Park shifted nervously near the exit, his role as lookout making him acutely aware of Mrs. Anderson's position at the front of the classroom. The art teacher was helping another student mix colors for a landscape project, her attention completely absorbed by the technical aspects of pigment combination and brush technique. Dylan's nervous energy manifested in constant fidgeting with his phone and adjusting his position to maintain the most effective blocking angle while appearing casual to any adult who might glance in their direction. His participation in Brad's schemes always filled him with conflicting emotions, providing protection from becoming a target while requiring him to participate in behaviors that violated his better instincts. Kevin Torres had positioned himself strategically near the supply counter where the industrial paper cutter sat like a silent threat among the more benign art materials. His stocky frame blocked the secondary exit route while keeping him within arm's reach of the cutting device. That would become central to Brad's planned escalation. Kevin had learned to suppress his occasional moments of conscience by convincing himself that their victims somehow deserved the treatment they received, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed him to participate in increasingly severe harassment without confronting the moral implications of his choices. The industrial paper cutter represented a significant escalation in the level of threat that Brad was prepared to deploy against Maya, unlike the psychological intimidation and minor physical harassment that had characterized their previous interactions. The cutting device introduced the possibility of serious bodily harm that would cross legal and ethical boundaries in ways that could not be dismissed or ignored. The machine's heavy metal construction and sharp blade were designed for precise cuts through multiple layers of paper, but its potential for causing injury made it a weapon in the hands of someone with malicious intent. Jessica Miller found herself frozen at her own workspace, her pencil trembling in her grip as she recognized the familiar pattern of escalation that preceded Brad's worst behaviors. Her own experiences with bullying during middle school had taught her to read the subtle signs that indicated when harassment was about to become something more dangerous. The coordinated positioning of Brad and his followers, combined with their proximity to potentially harmful equipment, created a scenario that far exceeded anything she had previously witnessed in their systematic campaign against Maya. Emma Rodriguez abandoned any pretense of working on her art project as she watched the developing confrontation with growing alarm. Her position on the student council had given her insight into the administration's efforts to address bullying through policy changes and educational programs. But those institutional responses seemed woefully inadequate when faced with the immediate reality of a student being threatened with actual physical harm. Emma found herself questioning not only her previous inaction, but the effectiveness of the entire system that was supposed to protect students like Maya from this kind of targeted violence. The conversation in the art classroom had gradually diminished as other students became aware of the tension building in Maya's corner of the room. Years of shared experience at Riverside High had taught them to recognize the warning signs that preceded Brad's most serious harassment incidents, creating a collective sense of unease that seemed to thicken the air with anticipation. The creative and supportive environment that Mrs. Anderson had carefully cultivated was being transformed into something that felt dangerous and unpredictable. Ryan Foster, whose senior status had provided some protection from Brad's attention in recent years, watched the unfolding situation with the kind of recognition that came from traumatic personal experience. During his freshman year, Ryan had endured months of systematic harassment that had escalated gradually from verbal taunts to threats of physical violence. The pattern he observed now was disturbingly familiar, suggesting that Maya was about to face the kind of confrontation that had left him with lasting anxiety about school environments and social interactions. Chloe Watson felt her comfortable sense of social security being challenged by the moral implications of what she was witnessing. Her popularity and family connections had always provided protection from becoming a target of harassment, but they had also created a sense of distance from the experiences of students who lacked similar advantages. Maya's quiet dignity and artistic talent had begun to earn Chloe's respect over the past few weeks, forcing her to confront her own role in maintaining the social dynamics that enabled Brad's behavior through passive acceptance and indifference. Maya's watercolor painting continued to develop under her steady brushstrokes, each layer of translucent color adding depth and complexity to her representation of the peaceful morning landscape visible from her bedroom window. The painting process itself had become a form of active meditation, connecting her to the natural beauty that surrounded Cedar Falls while providing an outlet for the creative expression that her grandfather had always encouraged alongside her. Martial arts training. The discipline required for watercolor techniques shared common foundations with karate practice in its demands for patience, precision, and the harmonious coordination of intention with execution. Brad's second verbal assault carried a more explicitly threatening tone as he leaned closer to Maya's chair, his voice dropping to a register that was intended to be heard only by his immediate target, while maintaining plausible deniability to any adults who might be monitoring the classroom. "You know what your problem is, Maya," he continued, his breath hot against the back of her neck. "You think you're special. You think you can just show up here and act like you're better than everyone else, but you're not special. You're just another pathetic loser who needs to learn her place in the real world." The words were designed to provoke an emotional response that would justify whatever escalation Brad had planned, following a psychological pattern that he had perfected through years of practice on vulnerable targets. His approach relied on creating anger or fear that would cause his victims to react in ways that could be used against them, either through inappropriate responses that would get them in trouble with authorities or through visible distress that would provide him with the satisfaction of having successfully broken their composure. Maya's response remained unchanged, her breathing steady and controlled as she continued adding delicate touches to her watercolor landscape. The insulting words seemed to flow around her like water around a stone, acknowledged but not absorbed into her emotional state. Her grandfather's teachings about maintaining inner peace, regardless of external provocation, had been reinforced through thousands of hours of meditation practice and stress inoculation training designed to prepare her for exactly this kind of psychological assault. Lee Chun's voice echoed in Maya's memory as she recalled one of their most important conversations about the nature of verbal aggression and its relationship to actual threat assessment. Her grandfather had explained that people who relied on words to intimidate others were often testing boundaries before escalating to physical violence, but they were also frequently revealed to be less dangerous than those who moved directly to action without warning. The key to appropriate response, he had taught her, was distinguishing between empty posturing designed to provoke reaction and genuine threats that indicated real intent to cause harm. David Kim, still positioned near the emergency communication system, found himself torn between his desire to alert authorities and his uncertainty about whether adult intervention would arrive in time to prevent whatever Brad had planned. His knowledge of their conspiracy, gained through accidental observation at the abandoned mill, created a sense of responsibility that was almost unbearable. David's own experiences as a target of harassment had taught him that seeking help from adults often resulted in delayed responses that failed to address immediate danger, while potentially creating retaliation against those who reported incidents. Mrs. Anderson's voice continued to provide instruction about artistic techniques and creative expression, her dedication to individual student guidance creating an ironic counterpoint to the ugliness developing in another part of her classroom. The teacher's commitment to fostering creativity and personal growth through art education had made Room 118 a sanctuary for many students over the years, but that positive environment was being violated by the kind of calculated cruelty that transformed safe spaces into venues for intimidation and harm. The collective awareness among students in the classroom had reached a level where even those not directly observing the confrontation could sense that something significant was building toward a climax. The subtle changes in conversation patterns, body language, and general energy created an atmosphere of tension that seemed to press against everyone present. Those students who had previously been victims of Brad's harassment recognized the signs from their own traumatic experiences, while others found themselves confronting the uncomfortable reality of witnessing systematic abuse without knowing how to respond effectively. Maya's connection to her painting served as more than just a calming focus. It represented her commitment to finding beauty and meaning even in circumstances that others might use as justification for abandoning their principles. The misty landscape taking shape under her brush symbolized the peace and harmony that her grandfather had taught her to cultivate within herself regardless of external chaos or threat. The artistic process itself became a demonstration of the kind of centered presence that could not be shaken by the anger or malice of others. Brad's frustration with Maya's continued composure began to manifest in more aggressive physical positioning as he moved even closer to her chair, his presence becoming increasingly invasive and threatening. The escalation followed a predictable pattern that he had used successfully against previous targets, combining psychological pressure with gradually increasing physical intimidation, designed to break down his victim's resistance to his demands. His experience had taught him that most people would eventually crack under sustained pressure, providing him with the satisfaction of having demonstrated his dominance while creating the kind of submission that reinforced his sense of personal power. The industrial paper cutter continued to loom as a silent threat in Kevin's vicinity, its presence adding a dimension of potential physical danger that elevated the situation far beyond typical schoolyard harassment. The machine's capacity for causing serious injury made it a weapon in the hands of someone with malicious intent, transforming what might otherwise be dismissed as adolescent social conflict into a scenario with genuinely dangerous implications. The fact that it was located in an educational environment under minimal supervision highlighted the vulnerabilities that existed even in spaces specifically designed to be safe for young people. Kevin Torres found himself experiencing conflicting emotions as he maintained his position near the cutting device, his role in Brad's plan requiring him to be prepared for actions that he had never previously contemplated. The stocky junior had convinced himself that their target somehow deserved the treatment they received, but the presence of equipment capable of causing serious bodily harm forced him to confront the possibility that their harassment campaign was moving into territory that could have permanent consequences. His loyalty to Brad was being tested against his instinctive understanding that what they were planning crossed fundamental lines about acceptable behavior. Dylan Parks continued his nervous surveillance of Mrs. Anderson's position while blocking the main exit route, his assignment requiring him to prevent Maya from leaving the classroom during whatever confrontation Brad had planned. The tall junior's fidgeting had increased as the tension in the room built toward what seemed like an inevitable climax, his nervous energy reflecting the moral discomfort that came from participating in behaviors that violated his better instincts. Dylan's role as a follower rather than an instigator provided him with psychological distance from the worst aspects of their harassment campaign, but it also made him complicit in whatever consequences might result. Maya's internal state remained anchored in the centered calm that years of meditation practice had made accessible even under extreme stress. The threatening presence behind her chair and the aggressive words, designed to provoke emotional reaction, were acknowledged and assessed, without being allowed to disturb the fundamental peace that her grandfather had taught her to cultivate. This psychological sanctuary provided the clarity necessary for making optimal decisions about how to respond to whatever escalation might occur, ensuring that her choices would be guided by wisdom rather than fear or anger. The moment was approaching when words would give way to more direct forms of confrontation, testing everything that Maya had learned about the appropriate use of martial arts skills in real-world situations. Her grandfather's teachings about the responsibility that came with possessing dangerous abilities flowed through her consciousness like a protective shield, reminding her that true strength was demonstrated through restraint and wisdom rather than the eagerness to prove one's capabilities through violence. The quiet new girl who had endured weeks of systematic harassment was about to discover whether her decade of training had prepared her for the ultimate test of character under pressure. Brad's patience finally snapped as Maya continued her methodical brushstrokes, seemingly oblivious to his presence and increasingly aggressive verbal assault. The quiet defiance of her continued painting struck him as the ultimate insult, a rejection of his authority that demanded immediate and decisive action. His hand shot out and grabbed Maya's wrist, stopping her brush mid-stroke and sending a small splash of gray watercolor across the otherwise pristine landscape she had been creating. The physical contact represented a clear escalation from psychological intimidation to actual assault, crossing a line that transformed the situation from harassment into something far more serious and dangerous. Maya's response to the sudden physical contact was immediate but controlled, her training automatically engaging the muscle memory that had been developed through thousands of hours of practice in her grandfather's dojo. Without appearing to exert any effort, she smoothly rotated her wrist in a small circular motion that broke Brad's grip using leverage rather than strength, a basic technique that was so fundamental to karate training that it had become as natural as breathing. The movement was executed with such fluid precision that Brad found his hand empty before he fully understood what had happened, leaving him momentarily confused and off balance. The brief demonstration of Maya's actual capabilities sent a ripple of surprise through the immediate vicinity, though most students in the classroom were not positioned to observe the subtle technique that had so effortlessly neutralized Brad's physical aggression. Jessica Miller, however, had been watching the confrontation with growing alarm and witnessed the graceful way that Maya had freed herself from what should have been an controlling grip. The movement had been so smooth and efficient that it seemed almost magical, suggesting that the quiet new girl possessed skills that none of them had suspected during her weeks of apparent vulnerability to harassment. Brad's confusion quickly transformed into rage as he realized that his attempt at physical dominance had been easily defeated by someone he had dismissed as weak and helpless. The fundamental worldview that had shaped his approach to social relationships was built on the assumption that physical force was the ultimate arbiter of power, and Maya's effortless escape from his grip challenged everything he believed about strength and control. His face flushed red with embarrassment and anger as he struggled to process an outcome that had never occurred during his previous campaigns of intimidation. Kevin Torres, observing the failed attempt at physical control from his position near the supply counter, felt a surge of panic that motivated him to escalate the situation beyond what had originally been planned. Without waiting for further instruction from Brad, Kevin grabbed the industrial paper cutter and lifted it from its position among the art supplies, its heavy metal construction and sharp blade gleaming under the classroom's fluorescent lighting. The decision to introduce an actual weapon into the confrontation represented a quantum leap in the level of danger that transformed what had been systematic harassment into a scenario with genuinely life-threatening implications. The sight of Kevin brandishing the paper cutter sent a wave of shock through the art classroom that could not be ignored even by students who had been trying to avoid involvement in the developing crisis. Emma Rodriguez gasped audibly and knocked over her water container in her surprise, the sound of spilling liquid and clattering materials finally drawing Mrs. Anderson's attention away from her individual consultation with another student. Art teacher turned toward the commotion with the expectation of addressing a minor accident, but the scene that greeted her was unlike anything she had encountered in nearly 2 decades of classroom management. David Kim, who had been positioned near the emergency communication system while struggling with his knowledge of their planned harassment, finally found the motivation to take decisive action when he saw the cutting device being wielded as a weapon. His fingers stabbed the panic button that would alert school security and administration to a classroom emergency. Though he knew that help would take several minutes to arrive even under the best circumstances, the decision to finally involve authorities came with the recognition that the situation had moved far beyond anything that could be resolved through peer intervention or adult mediation. Mrs. Anderson's voice cut through the classroom noise. With the authority of someone accustomed to maintaining order in environments filled with energetic teenagers, but her words died in her throat as she fully comprehended the scene unfolding in Maya's corner of the room. The sight of Kevin holding the industrial paper cutter in a threatening manner while Brad and Dylan surrounded a single student created a tableau that activated every protective instinct she had developed during her career as an educator. Her immediate impulse was to move toward the confrontation, but her training in crisis management reminded her that rushing into a situation involving weapons could escalate rather than resolve the danger. Maya's assessment of the dramatically changed threat level was instantaneous and comprehensive. Her grandfather's training in situational awareness, allowing her to process multiple variables simultaneously while maintaining the centered calm that would be essential for making optimal decisions under extreme pressure. The introduction of a cutting device capable of causing serious bodily harm moved the confrontation far beyond the realm of schoolyard harassment into territory that clearly justified defensive action according to the principles Chen had taught her about the appropriate use of martial arts skills. The memories of her grandfather's most serious conversations about self-defense flooded through Maya's consciousness with perfect clarity, including his detailed explanations about the legal and moral principles that govern the use of force in dangerous situations. Chen had been emphatic that martial artists had both the right and the responsibility to protect themselves and others from genuine harm, but he had also stressed that any defensive action must be proportional to the actual threat being faced. The presence of a weapon in the hands of someone who had already demonstrated hostile intent clearly met the threshold for justified self-defense that her training had prepared her to recognize. Kevin's grip on the paper cutter was awkward and unpracticed, revealing his lack of experience with tools that could be used as weapons. But the sharp blade and heavy construction made even clumsy handling potentially lethal. His stocky frame trembled slightly as he held the device, his own shock at the escalation he had initiated, beginning to compete with his loyalty to Brad and his commitment to their harassment campaign. The weight of the cutting machine in his hand seemed to represent the gravity of choices that could not be undone, forcing him to confront the possibility of consequences that extended far beyond anything they had previously contemplated. Dylan Parks found himself frozen between his assigned position blocking the exit and his growing realization that the situation had spiraled completely out of control. His nervous energy had transformed into genuine panic as he watched Kevin brandish a weapon that could cause permanent injury or worse, understanding that their harassment campaign had crossed into territory that would bring serious legal consequences regardless of the outcome. The tall junior's fidgeting had stopped entirely, replaced by the kind of paralysis that came from recognizing that every choice available to him carried the potential for devastating results. Brad's rage at being outmaneuvered by Maya's subtle defensive technique fueled his decision to support Kevin's escalation rather than attempting to de-escalate a situation that was rapidly moving beyond anyone's control. His worldview had been built on the assumption that superior physical force could overcome any resistance, and Maya's demonstration of unexpected capability challenged everything he believed about power and dominance. The presence of the cutting device seemed to offer a way to reassert his authority through intimidation that would force Maya to acknowledge his superiority, regardless of whatever martial arts tricks she might possess. Maya's watercolor painting lay before her with Brad's handprint smeared across one corner where his grab for her wrist had disrupted her careful work. The violent intrusion into her peaceful landscape serving as a visual metaphor for the way harassment could contaminate even the most constructive activities. The damaged artwork represented more than just destroyed property. It symbolized the broader impact of bullying on the educational environment that was supposed to provide safety and opportunity for creative expression. The sight of her ruined painting sparked a flicker of genuine anger that Maya had to consciously manage through the breathing techniques her grandfather had taught her for maintaining emotional control under stress. Li Chun's voice echoed in Maya's memory as she recalled their conversations about the difference between anger and righteous determination, two emotional states that could appear similar but led to very different outcomes in dangerous situations. Anger, her grandfather had explained, clouded judgment and led to choices that often created more problems than they solved, while righteous determination provided clarity and focus that enabled precise action in service of protection and justice. Maya found herself accessing that state of determined calm as she prepared to respond to a threat that had moved far beyond anything that could be resolved through patience and restraint. The other students in the classroom had begun to move away from the confrontation area as the seriousness of the situation became impossible to ignore. Their collective retreat creating a clear space around Maya and her antagonists that resembled a fighting ring more than an art classroom. The creative and supportive environment that Mrs. Anderson had carefully cultivated was being transformed into something that felt dangerous and unpredictable, with most students feeling helpless to intervene in a situation that had escalated beyond their ability to understand or control. Ryan Foster, whose senior status and previous experiences with Brad's harassment had given him insight into escalation patterns, found himself moving against the general flow of students seeking distance from the confrontation. His own traumatic memories from freshman year had taught him the importance of witnesses and potential allies during dangerous incidents, understanding that isolation was often what allowed harassment to escalate into serious violence. Ryan's decision to position himself where he could potentially intervene represented a form of moral courage that his younger self had not possessed during his own victimization. Chloe Watson's comfortable assumptions about social dynamics and personal safety were being shattered as she witnessed the transformation of routine harassment into something that threatened serious bodily harm to another student. Her privileged position in the school's social hierarchy had insulated her from understanding the daily reality of students who lacked similar protection, but the sight of Maya being threatened with actual violence forced her to confront the moral implications of her previous indifference. The recognition that her passive acceptance of Brad's behavior had contributed to this escalation created a sense of guilt that demanded some form of action. Mrs. Anderson had begun moving carefully toward the emergency phone in her classroom, while maintaining visual contact with the confrontation, her teacher training having prepared her for various crisis scenarios, but nothing quite like the scene unfolding before her. The art classroom was supposed to be a sanctuary where students could explore their creativity and express themselves safely. But the presence of a weapon in the hands of an aggressive student had transformed her carefully managed environment into something that felt more like a war zone than an educational space. Kevin's voice cracked with nervous energy as he raised the paper cutter higher, his words carrying the kind of desperate aggression that came from someone who had committed to a course of action without fully understanding its implications. "You think you're so special, Maya," he shouted, his stocky frame trembling with adrenaline and fear. "Let's see how special you feel when you're missing a finger. Brad's right. You need to learn your place. And if you won't do it yourself, maybe we need to help you understand." The threat was explicit and immediate, representing a clear intent to cause serious bodily harm that eliminated any remaining ambiguity about the level of danger Maya was facing. Maya's response to the direct threat was immediate and decisive. her body moving with the fluid precision that came from years of training, designed to prepare her for exactly this kind of life-threatening situation. In one smooth motion, she rose from her chair and assumed a defensive stance that immediately changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Her centered balance and ready position communicating a level of preparation and capability that shocked everyone present. The transformation was so complete and unexpected that it seemed as if a different person had taken Maya's place, someone who radiated confidence and controlled power rather than vulnerability and fear. The sight of Maya's martial arts stance sent a ripple of amazement through the students who were positioned to observe the sudden change in her demeanor and capabilities. Jessica Miller found herself staring in disbelief at the graceful way Maya had moved, the fluid transition from sitting artist to prepared fighter, revealing skills that none of them had suspected during her weeks of apparent passivity in the face of harassment. The quiet new girl who had endured systematic abuse without visible resistance had been transformed before their eyes into someone who clearly possessed the ability to defend herself against multiple attackers. Li Chun's training took complete control of Maya's responses as muscle memory developed through thousands of hours of practice, guided her movements with automatic precision. Her grandfather's voice seemed to speak directly into her consciousness, reminding her of the principles that should guide any defensive action. Use only the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. Prioritize the safety of innocent bystanders and maintain enough control to de-escalate the situation once the immediate danger had passed. The years of philosophical instruction about the responsible use of martial arts skills provided the framework for her tactical decisions as the confrontation entered its most dangerous phase. Kevin's advance with the paper cutter was clumsy and telegraphed, his lack of training in weapon handling making his movements predictable to someone with Maya's level of preparation and experience. As he lunged forward with the cutting device raised above his head, Maya smoothly stepped to the side while simultaneously executing a precise wrist control technique that redirected his momentum and trapped his weapon arm in a position where he could no longer threaten anyone. The movement was so efficient and controlled that Kevin found himself disarmed and immobilized before he fully understood what had happened. The paper cutter clattering harmlessly to the floor as Maya maintained her grip on his wrist with just enough pressure to prevent any further aggressive action. The speed and precision of Maya's defensive technique created a moment of stunned silence in the art classroom as everyone present struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Kevin Torres, who moments earlier had been wielding a dangerous weapon in a threatening manner, was now held in a control position that made him completely helpless while causing no apparent injury or pain. The technique demonstrated a level of skill and restraint that seemed almost impossible, neutralizing the serious threat while maintaining the kind of ethical boundaries that her grandfather had emphasized throughout her training. Dylan Parks, witnessing the effortless way that Maya had disarmed Kevin, found himself backing away from his position near the exit as the realization dawned that their intended victim possessed capabilities that made their entire harassment campaign not just morally wrong, but tactically disastrous. The tall junior's nervous energy had transformed into genuine fear as he understood that Maya could have defended herself at any point during the weeks of abuse they had inflicted, choosing restraint and patience instead of the kind of physical retaliation that would have ended their campaign immediately and possibly resulted in serious injury to himself and his companions. Brad Williams stared in disbelief at the scene before him, his fundamental understanding of power and dominance shattered by the demonstration of Maya's true capabilities. The quiet new girl who had been the target of his harassment campaign had revealed herself to be someone who possessed skills that made his reliance on intimidation and physical aggression seem pathetic and childish by comparison. The ease with which Maya had neutralized Kevin's weapon attack while maintaining complete control over the situation challenged everything Brad believed about strength and revealed his own methods to be the tactics of someone who was actually Weak rather than powerful, Mrs. Anderson had reached the emergency phone and was in the process of requesting immediate administrative and security response when she witnessed Maya's defensive action. The teacher's crisis management training providing her with enough understanding to recognize that the situation had been resolved through the student's own capabilities rather than adult intervention. The art teacher found herself experiencing a complex mixture of relief that the immediate danger had passed and amazement at the level of skill and restraint that Maya had demonstrated under extreme pressure. Maya's control of Kevin was maintained, with exactly the amount of pressure necessary to prevent him from resuming his attack, while causing no unnecessary pain or injury, demonstrating the kind of precise application of force that represented the highest levels of martial arts development. Her grandfather's teachings about the importance of restraint and proportional response were evident in every aspect of her technique, showing that true mastery came not from the ability to cause maximum damage, but from the wisdom to use minimum force to achieve the necessary outcome. The paper cutter lay on the classroom floor where it had fallen when Maya disarmed Kevin, its presence serving as a stark reminder of how close the situation had come to serious violence and permanent consequences. The industrial cutting device that had been transformed into a weapon was once again just a piece of art classroom equipment, but its brief role in the confrontation had changed the way everyone present understood the potential for ordinary objects to become dangerous in the hands of people with malicious intent. Emma Rodriguez found herself moving toward the confrontation area despite the potential danger. Her role as a student council member, creating a sense of responsibility for helping to resolve the crisis in a way that would benefit everyone involved. The demonstration of Maya's capabilities had shifted the power dynamic completely, but Emma recognized that the situation still required careful management to prevent further escalation and to address the underlying issues that had led to such a dangerous confrontation in the first place. David Kim, who had activated the emergency alert system when he saw Kevin brandish the cutting device, continued to document the scene with the kind of detailed observation that his photography background had taught him to maintain even under stress. His knowledge of Brad's planned harassment, combined with his witness testimony about the actual events, would prove crucial for any administrative or legal proceedings that might result from the incident. Ryan Foster approached the area where Maya maintained her control of Kevin, his own experiences with victimization giving him insight into the complex emotions that both the defender and the aggressor might be experiencing in the aftermath of such a dramatic confrontation. The senior's decision to position himself as a potential ally and witness represented the kind of moral courage that he had not possessed during his own harassment but had developed through years of reflection on those traumatic experiences. Chloe Watson found herself reevaluating everything she thought she knew about strength, vulnerability, and the social dynamics that had shaped her high school experience. The quiet new girl who had been dismissed as weak and helpless had demonstrated capabilities that made the popular students' concerns about social status seem trivial by comparison. Maya's combination of artistic sensitivity and martial arts skill challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between different types of talent and personal development. Maya's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the same calm authority that had characterized her physical response to the threat. Her words directed primarily toward Kevin, but clearly audible to everyone in the immediate area. "Kevin, I'm going to release your wrist now," she said, her tone neither angry nor threatening, but simply matter of fact. "The paper cutter is on the floor, and you're not going to pick it up. You're going to step back and give everyone some space to think about what just happened here. Do you understand me?" The question was posed in a way that offered Kevin a face-saving way to comply, while making clear that continued aggression would not be tolerated. Kevin's response was a barely audible acknowledgement as Maya gradually released the pressure on his wrist, her movements controlled and deliberate to ensure that he understood the restraint She was showing rather than interpreting her release as a sign of weakness. The stocky junior found himself massaging his wrist, not because Maya had caused any injury, but because the precision of her control had made him acutely aware of how easily she could have chosen to cause serious harm instead of simply neutralizing his ability to threaten others. Brad Williams stood several feet away from the central confrontation, his role as the instigator of the harassment campaign making him uncertain about how to respond to an outcome that had completely subverted his expectations. The demonstration of Maya's capabilities had revealed his own reliance on intimidation and aggression to be not just morally wrong but tactically inferior to the kind of disciplined skill that came from years of serious training and character development. Dylan Parks had moved even further from his original position near the exit, his nervous energy replaced by a kind of paralysis that came from recognizing the complete failure of their harassment strategy. The tall junior's understanding of social dynamics had been based on the assumption that victims were inherently weak and that aggressors held all the power. But Maya's response had demonstrated that these assumptions could be completely wrong, and that their entire approach had been built on fundamental misunderstandings about strength and vulnerability. Mrs. Anderson approached the group with the kind of controlled urgency that came from years of managing classroom crises, her priority being to ensure that the immediate danger had completely passed while beginning the process of addressing the underlying issues that had led to such a serious confrontation. The art teacher's training had prepared her for various emergency scenarios, but the combination of weapon threats and martial arts responses was beyond anything she had previously encountered in her educational career. Maya's attention remained focused on the three boys who had threatened her while maintaining awareness of the other students in the classroom, her grandfather's training having emphasized the importance of situational awareness that extended beyond the immediate threat to include potential complications or additional dangers. The disciplined alertness that characterized her posture and expression demonstrated the kind of comprehensive preparedness that came from understanding that dangerous situations could evolve rapidly and unpredictably. The transformation in the classroom atmosphere was palpable as students who had witnessed Maya's defensive capabilities began to process the implications of what they had seen. The quiet new girl who had endured weeks of systematic harassment without visible resistance had revealed herself to be someone who possessed skills that made their previous assumptions about strength and vulnerability seem naive and uninformed. The demonstration had challenged everyone present to reconsider their understanding of power dynamics and the nature of true courage. Li Chen's philosophical teaching seemed to guide Maya's words as she addressed the broader group of students who had gathered around the confrontation area, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from having successfully navigated a life-threatening situation through wisdom and skill rather than anger and violence. "What happened here today didn't have to happen," she said, her gaze moving among Brad, Dylan, and Kevin before including the other students in her address. "I've been training in martial arts since I was 5 years old, but I never wanted to use those skills in a situation like this. I hoped that patience and restraint would be enough to resolve the problems we've been having. But when someone threatens serious violence, that changes everything." The explanation provided context for Maya's response while also offering insight into the decision-making process that had guided her actions throughout the weeks of harassment and during the final confrontation. Her grandfather's emphasis on using martial arts skills only when absolutely necessary was evident in her words, demonstrating the kind of ethical framework that separated true martial artists from people who simply enjoyed fighting or causing harm to others. Brad's voice, when he finally managed to speak, carried none of the aggressive confidence that had characterized his approach to the confrontation, replaced instead by a tone that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Maya, I had no idea," he began, his words trailing off as he struggled to process the implications of what he had witnessed. The fundamental assumptions about power and dominance that had shaped his approach to social relationships had been completely undermined by Maya's demonstration of superior capability, combined with remarkable restraint. Maya's response to Brad's partial apology was measured and thoughtful, reflecting her grandfather's teachings about the importance of offering opportunities for growth and redemption, even to those who had chosen to act as enemies. "Brad, you had no idea because you never tried to learn anything about me beyond what you needed to justify treating me badly," she replied, her words carrying the weight of accumulated experience, but without the kind of anger that might have prevented him from hearing their truth. "You saw someone who seemed vulnerable and decided that made me a good target for harassment, but you never considered that there might be more to the situation than what appeared on the surface." The insight challenged not only Brad but everyone present to examine their own assumptions about the relationship between appearance and reality, the nature of strength and vulnerability, and the moral obligations that came with possessing advantages over others. Maya's words suggested that the harassment campaign had been based on fundamental misunderstandings that could have been avoided through the kind of genuine curiosity and respect that should characterize interactions between people in any community. Kevin Torres found himself struggling to articulate an apology that could adequately address the seriousness of threatening someone with a weapon, his understanding of the legal and ethical implications of his actions beginning to penetrate through the adrenaline and confusion that had characterized his decision-making during the confrontation. The realization that Maya could have seriously injured him in response to his attack, but had chosen instead to neutralize the threat with minimal force, created a sense of gratitude that competed with his shame about his own behavior. Dylan Parks approached the group with the kind of tentative movement that suggested he was seeking permission to participate in the conversation, his nervous energy replaced by a more genuine emotion that might eventually develop into authentic remorse for his role in the harassment campaign. The tall junior's understanding of social dynamics had been completely altered by witnessing Maya's response to their threats, forcing him to reconsider not only his relationship with Brad and Kevin, but his entire approach to navigating the complex social environment of high school. Mrs. Anderson had been joined by Principal Roberts and 2 security officers who had responded to the emergency alert, but the administrative team found themselves dealing with an incident that had already been resolved through student action rather than adult intervention. The art teacher's explanation of what she had witnessed provided the officials with a framework for understanding both the severity of the threat that had been posed and the remarkable restraint that Maya had shown in her defensive response. Principal Roberts, a veteran administrator with extensive experience in crisis management, found himself facing a situation that challenged many of the standard protocols for dealing with violence and weapons in school settings. The fact that the student who had been threatened had possessed the capability to defend herself while maintaining ethical boundaries that prevented unnecessary harm created a complex set of circumstances that required careful consideration of both immediate consequences and longer-term implications for school safety and community relationships. Maya's conversation with the arriving adults demonstrated the same thoughtful approach that had characterized her response to the physical threat. Her explanation of events focusing on the facts of what had occurred while avoiding inflammatory language that might escalate tensions or complicate the resolution process. Her grandfather's teachings about the importance of clear communication during crisis situations provided guidance for presenting information in ways that would help authorities make informed decisions about appropriate responses. The paper cutter that had precipitated the final escalation was carefully secured by the security officers as evidence of the weapon threat that had justified Maya's defensive action, though everyone present understood that the real significance of the incident lay not in the physical evidence, but in the transformation of relationships and understanding that had resulted from the confrontation. The cutting device would be returned to its normal function as art classroom equipment, but its brief role as a weapon had changed the way everyone involved thought about safety, preparedness, and the potential for ordinary situations to become dangerous. Jessica Miller approached Maya with the kind of awe and gratitude that came from witnessing someone demonstrate the courage and skill to protect not only herself but potentially others who might have been harmed if the situation had escalated further. The shy sophomore's own experiences with bullying had taught her to appreciate the rarity of finding someone willing and able to stand up effectively against systematic harassment, understanding that Maya's response had created opportunities for positive change that extended far beyond the immediate resolution of their specific conflict. Emma Rodriguez found herself volunteering to help document the incident for administrative review, while also offering to facilitate ongoing discussions about bullying prevention and community building among the student body. Her role in student government had given her insight into the institutional approaches to addressing harassment, but Maya's demonstration of individual courage had shown her the importance of personal responsibility and direct action in creating the kind of school environment where all students could feel safe and supported. David Kim's photographic documentation of the incident and his witness testimony about the planned nature of the harassment provided crucial evidence for administrative and potentially legal proceedings, but his most important contribution was his decision to finally speak up about what he had observed and overheard. The quiet junior's choice to break his silence about Brad's conspiracy represented the kind of moral courage that could prevent future incidents by ensuring that planning for violence or harassment would be met with community response rather than passive acceptance. Ryan Foster's decision to position himself as a witness and potential ally during the confrontation had been motivated by his own experiences with victimization, but the aftermath of the incident provided him with opportunities to use those painful experiences constructively by helping other students understand the long-term impacts of harassment and the importance of creating supportive community responses to bullying behavior. Chloe Watson's reevaluation of her own role in the social dynamics that had enabled Brad's harassment campaign led to a deeper understanding of how privilege and popularity carried moral obligations to protect those who lacked similar advantages. Her recognition that passive acceptance of bullying was a form of complicity motivated her to become more actively involved in creating the kind of inclusive school culture where harassment would be neither tolerated nor ignored by the community. The weeks that followed the art classroom incident brought profound changes to the culture and community relationships at Riverside High School, with Maya's demonstration of courage and restraint serving as a catalyst for broader conversations about strength, responsibility, and the kind of environment that the school community wanted to create together. The quiet new girl who had endured systematic harassment without complaint had revealed herself to be someone whose example could inspire positive transformation in others, showing that true leadership often emerged from unexpected sources and in unexpected ways. Brad Williams found himself facing not only administrative consequences for his role in organizing the harassment campaign, but also the more challenging task of examining the fundamental assumptions about power and relationships that had guided his behavior throughout high school. The recognition that Maya could have defeated him physically at any point during their weeks of conflict, but had chosen patience and restraint, instead forced him to confront the difference between actual strength and the kind of bullying behavior that he had mistaken for dominance. The transformation in Brad's understanding and behavior was gradual but genuine, beginning with sincere apologies to Maya and the other students who had been targets of his harassment and evolving into active efforts to create the kind of positive school culture that would prevent future incidents of systematic abuse. His journey from aggressor to advocate was closely monitored by school officials and supported by counseling services. But the most important factor in his development was his growing recognition that true strength came from protecting others rather than intimidating them. Kevin Torres and Dylan Parks followed similar paths of reflection and growth, their experiences with the consequences of following Brad's leadership teaching them important lessons about personal responsibility and the importance of making independent moral choices. Their participation in peer mediation programs and community service projects provided opportunities to demonstrate genuine change while also contributing positively to the school environment that they had previously helped to damage through their harassment activities. Maya's role in the school community evolved naturally from her demonstration of courage and principle during the art classroom incident, with other students seeking her guidance and support in addressing their own experiences with bullying and conflict resolution. Her combination of martial arts skill and philosophical wisdom inherited from her grandfather's teachings made her an effective mediator and mentor for students who were struggling with various forms of social and academic challenges. The peer mediation program that developed around Maya's example became a model for other schools throughout the region, demonstrating the effectiveness of approaches that emphasized restorative justice and community building rather than purely punitive responses to behavioral problems. The program's success was built on the recognition that most conflicts arose from misunderstandings and failed communication rather than fundamental character flaws, and that appropriate intervention could transform antagonistic relationships into supportive ones. Mrs. Anderson incorporated lessons about conflict resolution and ethical decision-making into her art curriculum, using creative projects as vehicles for exploring themes related to community building and personal responsibility. The art classroom that had been the site of such a dangerous confrontation was transformed into a space where students could explore not only their artistic capabilities, but also their potential for positive leadership and social contribution. Principal Roberts implemented comprehensive policy changes that addressed both the prevention of harassment and the support of students, who demonstrated the kind of moral courage that Maya had exhibited during the crisis. The administrative response recognized that creating safe school environments required not only protecting potential victims, but also celebrating and supporting those who were willing to take personal risks to defend others and uphold community values. The story of what had happened in Room 118 spread throughout Cedar Falls and beyond, inspiring discussions about bullying prevention, martial arts education, and the importance of teaching young people both the skills and the wisdom necessary to respond appropriately to dangerous situations. Maya's example demonstrated that effective self-defense required not only physical capability, but also the kind of character development that would ensure those capabilities were used responsibly and ethically. Chen, when he learned about his granddaughter's experience through their weekly phone conversations, expressed the deep pride that came from knowing that his teachings had been applied successfully in exactly the kind of situation they had been designed to address. The elderly martial arts instructor understood that Maya's choice to use minimum necessary force while maintaining ethical boundaries represented the highest achievement possible for any student of traditional fighting arts. The friendship that developed between Maya and several of her former antagonists surprised many observers, but reflected the transformative power of authentic remorse and genuine forgiveness working together to create new possibilities for human relationship. Brad's evolution from aggressor to protector, supported by Maya's willingness to accept his sincerity and help him develop better approaches to social interaction, became an example of the kind of personal growth that was possible when people were willing to examine their mistakes honestly and commit to meaningful change. The annual Character and Leadership Awards ceremony at Riverside High School eventually included recognition not only for Maya's courage during the art classroom incident, but also for the positive changes that Brad, Kevin, and Dylan had made in their own behavior and their contributions to improving school culture. The transformation of antagonistic relationships into supportive partnerships demonstrated the potential for redemption and growth that existed within every individual and every community. Maya's watercolor painting, damaged during the initial confrontation, was carefully restored through a collaborative project that included technical expertise from the art department and symbolic contributions from students throughout the school. The repaired artwork became a permanent display in the main hallway, serving as a visual reminder of the possibility for healing and beauty to emerge even from experiences of conflict and damage. The legacy of the art classroom incident extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence policy discussions at the district and state levels about the integration of character education and practical life skills into standard academic curricula. Maya's example demonstrated that young people were capable of remarkable wisdom and restraint when they had been provided with appropriate training and philosophical guidance, suggesting that martial arts education might have valuable applications beyond traditional athletic programs. Years later, as Maya prepared to graduate as valedictorian of her class at Riverside High School, her commencement address would focus on the lessons she had learned about the relationship between strength and compassion, the importance of preparation and training in developing confidence and capability, and the transformative power of choosing forgiveness and growth over anger and revenge. The quiet new girl who had arrived in Cedar Falls hoping simply to complete her education without incident had discovered that sometimes the most important learning occurred outside the formal curriculum through experiences that tested character and revealed the potential for ordinary individuals to create extraordinary positive change in their communities. The friendship between Maya and Brad, which had grown from the ashes of their confrontational beginning, would continue throughout their college years and beyond, serving as a living example of the possibility for human beings to transcend their worst impulses and create relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to positive values. Their story became part of the oral tradition at Riverside High School, passed down through successive classes as evidence that transformation was always possible for those who were willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination and genuine change. Maya's grandfather's teachings, transmitted through his granddaughter's example and continued through the peer mediation program she helped establish, would influence thousands of young people over the years, creating ripple effects of positive change that extended far beyond what any single incident might have been expected to produce. The ancient wisdom of traditional martial arts, combined with the courage to apply those principles in modern situations, had created a legacy that would continue to inspire and guide future generations of students facing their own challenges and opportunities for moral leadership. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.